I'm 79 years old, and I've watched enough people pray to know this. Most prayers were never really about what the person said they were praying for. That's the first thing life teaches you when you live long enough to see the full arc of things. You watch someone pray desperately for a relationship to work out, and it doesn't. 15 years later, you can see with your own eyes that it working out would have been a catastrophe. You watch someone beg heaven for a job they didn't get, and the rejection broke them for a year, and then that same rejection pushed them sideways into the one thing they were actually built to do. You start to understand something that young people simply cannot understand yet, not because they're not intelligent, but because they haven't stood where you're standing. You can't see the whole painting when your nose is pressed against it. Prayer gets answered on a different timeline than the one you're operating on when you're kneeling down and asking. And here's what most people miss. They're measuring answers against their request. They asked for X, they got Y, so they conclude the prayer wasn't answered, or worse, that it was rejected. But that's like a child asking a parent for candy before dinner, getting a full meal instead, concluding the parent didn't hear them. The request was heard. The need behind the request was understood more deeply than the asker understood it themselves. This is the first hidden layer of how prayer actually works. The surface request is never the real prayer. Underneath every spoken prayer is an unspoken longing, and that longing is almost always more honest and more accurate than the words sitting on top of it. Someone prays for money, but what they're really praying for is security, for the feeling that they're going to be okay, that the ground won't fall out from beneath them. And sometimes that prayer gets answered not with money, but with a sudden, unexpected peace that doesn't make logical sense given the circumstances. A peace that allows them to think clearly, to act without panic, to find a path they couldn't have found while their mind was on fire with fear. That's the prayer being answered at the level of the real need rather than the stated request. But it goes even deeper than that. There is a category of prayer that gets answered through loss. This is the one nobody wants to talk about because it sounds cruel, and when you're in the middle of it, it feels cruel. But you live long enough and you see it happen. Not once, not twice, but so many times that it stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern you can almost set your watch by. The thing that gets taken away is the thing that was preventing the arrival of the thing that was actually needed. And in that moment of loss, that brutal, disorienting, seemingly senseless loss, people call out to whatever they believe in with more authenticity, more raw honesty, more genuine vulnerability than they ever managed during the comfortable years. And it's exactly that kind of prayer. Stripped of performance, stripped of negotiation, stripped of the careful phrasing we use when we still think we're in control. That seems to move something. The prayers that carry the most weight are the ones that cost something to say. When you've been praying politely your whole life, asking for reasonable things in measured tones, and then something happens that breaks you open, and you stop being polite and you stop being measured and you just pour out what's actually true, that's when something shifts. I've seen this happen to people across decades of watching lives unfold. The moment the pretense dropped, and what always strikes me is that the shift in their circumstances didn't always happen immediately after, but something in them shifted, something fundamental. And from that shift, things began to move. Now, here's the layer that almost no one talks about. There's a category of answered prayer that looks, from the outside, exactly like unanswered prayer. The person never gets what they asked for. Never. Not a version of it, not a substitute. The thing they wanted never materializes. And yet, decades later, they will tell you, not bitterly, not with resignation, but with a kind of wonder, that they received something far more important. Not the thing, but the capacity to live without the thing, and that capacity, that freedom from the grip of particular desperate want, turned out to be the door to everything that actually mattered in their lives. The prayer was answered with an enlargement of the person, rather than a fulfillment of the request. That's a hard teaching. It was hard for me to see it the first time, and it gets no easier to witness, but it's real. And if you've lived long enough, you've seen it too, even if you haven't had words for it until now. Here's what's actually happening when prayer works at its deepest level. It's not primarily a transaction. It's not a vending machine where you insert the right words in the right order and the right outcome drops out at the bottom. The people who treat it that way are almost always disappointed, and they should be, because they've fundamentally misread what prayer is. Prayer, at its deepest level, is an act of alignment. You are not informing the universe of what you need. The universe, or God, or whatever word you use for the force that holds everything together, is not waiting on your announcement to know your situation. What you're doing when you pray, really doing, is moving yourself into a different relationship with your own circumstances. You're shifting from the closed fist of control to the open hand of trust. And that shift, that internal, invisible, deeply personal shift, is where the actual power lives. And here's what most people miss about that shift: it doesn't require certainty. It doesn't require a fully formed faith or a theology that holds together under pressure. The most potent prayers I've ever observed, and I've observed a great many, were prayed by people who weren't even sure anyone was listening. They prayed anyway, not because they were confident, but because they were desperate enough to try. And in that trying, something opened up. The act of reaching out, even into what feels like empty air, changes something in the one who is reaching. It reorganizes the interior. It moves fear from the driver's seat. And once fear is not driving, entirely different possibilities become visible. This is why so many prayers seem to get answered immediately after the person stops fighting the outcome. Not because the fighting was wrong, but because the exhaustion of the fight finally created the stillness necessary for something new to enter. There's a paradox built into the deepest structure of prayer, and it is this: the answer often cannot arrive until you've genuinely made peace with the possibility that it won't. That sounds like it contradicts the whole enterprise. Why pray if you have to be okay with not receiving? But that's not what it means. It means that the strangling grip of outcome dependence creates a kind of spiritual and psychological closure that blocks the very thing being sought. Open your hand, and things can be placed in it. The closed fist holds only what it was already holding. Now, let's go deeper into the prayers that do appear to be answered in the straightforward, literal sense. You asked for something specific, and specifically that thing arrived. Because even here, there's more happening than it appears. These moments become, for the people who experience them, reference points, anchors. They carry them forward through the years that follow, through the prayers that seem to receive no response, through the dark stretches where nothing makes sense and nothing seems to be moving. The memory of the answered prayer becomes a form of testimony they carry inside themselves. It's not proof in any scientific sense, but it's evidence of a different kind, the kind that lives in a person and holds them upright when logic alone cannot. And so even the literal, direct, unmistakable answered prayer serves a purpose beyond its immediate content. It builds something in the person that they will need later for something they cannot yet imagine. And this brings us to one of the deepest truths about prayer that almost nobody discusses. Prayer changes the person praying more reliably than it changes the circumstances. This isn't a consolation prize. This isn't the thing you say to make someone feel better about not getting what they wanted. It is the central function of the practice. The person who prays regularly, sincerely, honestly, not performing prayer but actually doing it, becomes different. Their perception changes. Their capacity for patience grows, not because they become passive, but because they develop a deeper relationship with time and with process. Their capacity for gratitude expands because they've been in the posture of receiving often enough that they begin to notice what was already there. Their relationship with fear changes, not because frightening things stop happening, but because they've built up a kind of interior muscle through the repeated practice of releasing what they cannot control. This is the practical power of prayer, and it's available to everyone, regardless of what they believe about the mechanism. You don't have to have a theological position worked out to access this. You just have to be willing to be honest, willing to be still, and willing to say what is actually true for you in this moment. Not what you think you should be saying, not the sanctioned version of your need, but the real version. The one that maybe embarrasses you a little because it's so naked and so specific and so human. That's the prayer that does the deep work. That's the one that lands. Here is how you apply all of this in your actual life, starting now. Stop evaluating your prayers by whether you received the literal thing you asked for. Start asking instead, what changed in me? What became possible after I prayed that wasn't possible before? Not in my circumstances necessarily, but in my interior. What can I see now that I couldn't see when I was white-knuckling the outcome? Because the real answer to your prayer may already be present. It may already be living inside the change in you that you've been too focused on the original request to notice. And when a prayer seems to go completely unanswered, when the loss is real, when the thing did not come, when the door did not open, sit with the question of what that closure is protecting you from or redirecting you toward. Not every closed door has a visible alternate route on the other side of it. Sometimes you have to walk into apparent emptiness before the floor becomes solid beneath you, but it becomes solid. I've watched this enough times to say it without flinching. It becomes solid. You live long enough and you stop seeing prayer as a request line and start seeing it as a compass. It doesn't always take you where you thought you were going, but it keeps you oriented and keeps you moving in a direction that is, in the end, more yours than the one you originally plotted. And if you are willing to pay attention, not just to what you receive, but to who you are becoming through the asking, you will find that the life you're living is, in ways that matter most, the answer to the deepest prayer you were always praying underneath all the others. The one that had no words, the one that was simply, let me become who I'm supposed to be. Let me live a life that means something. Let me be okay, in the deepest sense of that word, no matter what comes. That prayer, in my experience, is the one that gets answered most completely, and it takes a whole life to see it fully. But when you finally see it, you recognize it, and you know